Hello, welcome back, and today we are finishing up the first semester with our introduction to the second New Deal, aptly named because it becomes after the first New Deal. Your learning targets today are to analyze the programs of social and economic reform in the second New Deal. So, what did it address, basically? We'll describe the opposition to this New Deal. We'll describe how the New Deal affected women, blacks, and Native Americans, and how it changed party politics. So, what did the New Deal address? It was basically the third R, reform. So, it addresses the problems of the elderly, the poor, the unemployed, and it helps farmers, and it also helps to protect workers' rights. One of the main parts of the New Deal was the expanded public works section called the Works Progress Administration. So, the old one was PWA. This is WPA. They pretty much do the same thing. They build highways and dredged rivers, and they also fund artists to make art, not to mention still building airports, schools, libraries, government buildings, and so forth. John Maynard Keynes is the guy who basically, this is called Keynesian economics, and this is called pump priming. And essentially, what we do is we put money into the hands of consumers to buy stuff and stimulate the economy. And so we do deficit spend, which is spending more money than you have. And that's the whole point behind this, is to pump money into the economy so we can get it moving again. The Social Security Act provides Social Security. It's the beginning of Social Security, or a public pension system for the elderly. So if you have a job right now, you're paying into Social Security, and hopefully in 40 or 50 or 60 years, whenever you retire, it will be there and you'll get a check from the government. It's unemployment insurance also for people that lost their jobs. They can get what's called unemployment benefits. Workers, it also provides for workers' compensation for accidents, mothers and their children if their father has been killed, the blind, and the disabled. It does not apply to everybody at first, but some would argue that over the next 30 or 40 years it applies to too many people, and now we are paying out more than we're taking in, actually. So it later expands to cover almost everybody. Some people called it racist at first because it didn't apply to farmers, who were a lot of the times black, or domestic service workers, who were a lot of the times black. We also passed during the second New Deal the Rural Electrification Administration, which basically loans money to power companies to get to those very rural areas of the country that don't have power, and this helped modernize their farm with the advent of modern electricity. Labor unions begin to get more activity now. They First, membership was up, then it was down, then it was up, then it was down, now it's going up again. The New Deal goal for workers is to raise the living conditions of industrial workers, and so the Congress passes the National Labor Relations Act, or the NLRA, also known as the Wagner Act, which gives rights to workers to collective bargaining and makes unions a right that workers have. It also creates the National Labor Relations Board, which is still around today if workers want to file complaints against their employer. And also the Fair Labor Standards Act passed workers' rights and basically established a minimum wage, maximum hours worked, and outlawed child labor. In the union world, the Congress of Industrial Organizations is formed as kind of a alternative to the AFL, or the American Federation of Labor. Here in 15, 20 years from now, they will merge and become the AFL-CIO, which they are today. So the CIO represents lower paid, unskilled workers, and the AFL represents mostly white, skilled workers. And they'll combine here in a decade or so, after the 1930s or 40s. Opposition to the New Deal, the Supreme Court is pretty much opposed to it. They think a lot of people on the Supreme Court are Republican at this time, and they're opposed to the government getting involved in economics. And the famous case of Schechter Poultry versus the United States, one of the greatest Supreme Court names in history, basically says the NRA is unconstitutional. The National Recovery Administration, which is the direct relief to people, they were giving out relief to people. They declared that unconstitutional. They also declared the Agricultural Adjustment Act unconstitutional. So they're striking down these very major New Deal programs. And what's FDR's response? He wants to pack the court with more justices because the president gets to name justices to the Supreme Court. And he suggests adding 6 new justices. Congress sets up the makeup of the Supreme Court. They don't get to, it's not in the Constitution how many there are. They've just set the number at 9. He wants it to go up to 15 so that he can name people favorable to his policies. But Congress wants no part of this court packing plan, is what they call it. He eventually gets to name new justices anyway, favorable to his programs due to retirements from the Supreme Court. And in 1937, it's almost as if the New Deal is not working because another recession happens and unemployment rises to 20%. And in the 1938 midterm elections, the Democrats lose seats in Congress, and FDR loses a lot of support for the New Deal. How did the New Deal affect minorities? Well, women. It increased their political influence and promoted their own rights. Eleanor Roosevelt really advanced, and she was the president's eyes and ears. She went out around the country talking to people. She advances public health, education, and the arts. Frances Perkins is the first woman cabinet secretary. She's the head of I believe, the Labor Department in President Roosevelt's cabinet. FDR invites blacks to advise him on issues affecting blacks, and this is known as his black cabinet. And they do, but it doesn't mean that he is going to take their advice. That was kind of the trick there. Black unemployment improves, but discrimination, unfortunately, does not in the 1930s. And Native Americans, they actually pass an act restoring control over their reservation and their lands to Native Americans called the Indian Reorganization Act. And the Indians even had their own New Deal. They call it the Indian New Deal, programs that were created to give Indians economic assistance because they were in poverty. It was a terrible time to be an Indian. So they constructed new schools, hospitals, and do an Indian Civilian Conservation Corps to basically help the Indians' land improve. And the party politics change due to the Great Depression. So this New Deal coalition brings together African Americans, poor Midwestern farmers, northern blue-collar workers, and southern whites. People who would have never been politically aligned before are now aligned because of the New Deal. These are Democrats. These 4 groups of people, and it's important to know this, vote Democrat and elect Roosevelt to 4 terms as president. They give the Democrats a huge majority in both houses of Congress, so it's easy to get things done, and they unite people of different ethnic and social backgrounds. And FDR is the only president to win 3 and 4 terms. He increases the power of the presidency and the executive branch, and he creates and he makes the government of the United States into a welfare state, which is a government that assumes responsibility for taking care of its sick, disabled, poor, etc. And that's what the United States is today. That's all I have for you. Write down those learning targets, and I'll see you later. Goodbye.